marvelous! We all love a good sci-fi horror motion picture. But what if I said that you and your friends could live out such a movie, battling aliens, computer, and the darkest terror of all? Man, would you and your friends dare take me up on it? Oh my god! Welcome to Quinns Quest. We've finally got a sci-fi game on Quinns Quest, and it's the most exciting science fiction TTRPG you can buy right now. It's Mothership. And this little arsonist has set the community's imagination ablaze. It is a sci-fi starter. Now, at a glance, these stark two-tone rulebooks look simple, almost sterile. This is a horror game, it says. You can play a marine, scientist, teamster, or android. And not only are there no custom cards, miniatures, or dice, you are gonna have no special abilities at all. So it would be reasonable to be put off Mothership because it looks plain. But that would be like looking at the outside of a video game console and declaring, "But I'm not having fun yet, my friend." These cutting-edge devices are your doorway to a galaxy. If you read it, you will see that this game is a vehicle for every sci-fi trope that might have taken root in your fecund imagination. Like how in the future, computers will be bigger and corporations will be somehow even worse. But Mothership also has hundreds of new ideas for how the future could be bad. And though you wouldn't know it from the name or the generic cover art, this world definitely has its own voice. More than anything else, this is a game about our collective anxiety of living through late-stage capitalism. It's about being trapped in the teeth of gig work in a future where everything is privatized and trying to survive in the crushing gap between the horror movie in front of you and the implacable corporate hand on the small of your back. And let's be clear, this game will kill players in service of that aesthetic. But it's not all bad. This is also a universe filled with very funny brand names. I think one of my players is still carrying around a Ziploc baggie labeled Cocaine 2. And importantly, I'll just add here that this game might be worth paying attention to even if you don't like horror movies, because this, as you may have been able to deduce from this game's themes and its mastery of fonts, Mothership is that rarest of things in a TTRPG. It might be actually cool. I asked designer Sean McCoy where this countercultural stylishness came from in a section that I like to call, "What were you thinking?"
So I think horror just financially always sort of exists at the margins. Like horror is a great risk reward, right? They're usually pretty cheap to produce. They have a built-in audience that's like very dedicated that will go see cheap horror stuff. And occasionally one of them blows up and makes $300 million. And so I think that's what's allowed it to maintain its like edge or its aesthetic. And like the people who make it have a dedicated interest in being transgressive and finding those sort of like perverse isn't the right word, but like transgressive like boundaries, right? That keeps it like fresh and visual.
Another thing, just in terms of getting you excited about this game, Mothership is the only TTRPG where when a new hot adventure is released, I will stop my workday to perhaps fix myself a brandy and read it immediately. It's not just that these books are moreish and fun to read, it's that the best ones grasp what has historically been the point of science fiction over fantasy, which is science fiction is the genre of ideas. And Mothership's books are forever presenting you with high concepts that make you go, "Oh God," and make you say, "I need to put my players in this immediately," as if you were dredging so much trusting meat in high-quality marinade. You want to see these flavors develop. Of course, reading's all well and good, but have I played Mothership? You bet your pencils I have. That's the Quinns Quest guarantee. I put my players through 11 evenings of Mothership, in which I, the GM, assumed the role of various interstellar nasties, including rats, cats, cannibals, crabs, nerds, brackets synthetic, and once just a really, really big mouth. Which is how I know that this game, it even comes in a big deluxe edition, is quite simply doing shitloads that's worthy of analysis. So we gotta cut this review into chunks, we gotta get chapters up in here. First off, I want to talk about Mothership's unusual and successful presentation. Then I want to talk about the structure and rules, the game's compact musculature, with a few alien organs. Then I'm going to talk about the best bit of this game, which is quite simply how good these books are. Then you better believe I'm complaining a bit. And finally, I'm going to talk about what you should actually buy out of all these products if you want to play Mothership. Because if you see Mothership for sale, it might be in this quite generous core set. It might be in this very grand deluxe set. And we love a box set here in the TTRPG community. It groans, "Oh, I'm heavily pregnant with good times and I'll let you co-parent for $50. But pop those little baby booklets out and you'll see that where most RPGs come in hardbacks heavy enough to compress a toad into a two-dimensional discus, Mothership's books are no bigger than the average television instruction manual. So you might then assume that Mothership is some kind of exercise in minimalism, simple rules and short stories for non-committal people with bad imaginations. But that is abundantly incorrect. Crack open Mothership's zines and you'll find so much text, so many deviant little nouns, whole suspicious puddles of creativity. This game is not only as exhaustive and helpful as anything I've covered on Quinns Quest, it just came out and it already has more adventures for sale and more stuff to explore than most RPGs you could be playing. Ideas and jokes and style ooze out of Mothership's official modules, like so much empurpled mucus from an alien's egg. You see, Mothership's books are only small because of a startling commitment to form factor. That's a big book getting smaller is what I'm doing. It makes sense. Shut up. In its layout, copywriting, in the design of the rules and the modules themselves, the Mothership team, the writers, artists, and layout specialists all seem like they were in competition with one another to do more with less, and so have compressed Mothership in on itself like someone cranked up the artificial gravity. Often, this takes the form of using shed loads of diligently constructed random tables that can bring a people or location fully to life in half the pages it would take to describe it. Because the fact is, being a good GM is rarely ever helped by being good. People are going to think I Foleyed that in as a joke. It's not true. I just moved house next to a bottle bank. Because the fact is, being a good GM is rarely ever helped by being given whole paragraphs or pages to read. It's much more like being a short order cook. Just tell me what I have to make the customer. For example, like this is from a page of NPCs you might find on a space station. Name, McCabe. Who are they? Warp core mechanic. Here's a quote. "Jumping is a form of prayer. You gotta be devout and you gotta be crazy." I've seen this more and more in RPGs, that rather than giving you a description of an NPC, they just give you a good quote from them and they let your imagination fill in who they are. It works great. So yeah, these small, dense books are phenomenal. Although I do wish the Mothership developers would spare a thought for the TTRPG reviewers whose aesthetic involves dropping heavy books on a table. It's rubbish. All of which is to say, Mothership is every bit as epic as anything you could be playing. You get a dragon's hoard of content in the deluxe set, and all of it is as micro-engineered and full of violent promise as a Swiss Army knife. Although, as to which of these two box sets you should buy, I'll be talking about that and why the answer might be neither at the end of this video. Just before we move on, I'll add that the art you're seeing in this video might come across as a little more basic than some of the luxurious illustrations you've seen in other games on Quinns Quest. I'll also point out that I love this art. It not only conjures a ton of atmosphere in the manner of overheated cookware releasing toxic gas, what's great is that every official adventure has a different aesthetic. In other RPGs, those glorious pictures with their detailed backgrounds are there to break up the interminable swamp of words that you are wading through. Whereas in Mothership, where the layout has the color and energy and impact of a jungle gym, the illustrations are simply free to work with the copywriting to create one harmonious vision. And that vision is spooky. I feel like I've made a big mess. Let me tidy up a second. Okay, I've tidied up. It might not look like it, but that's sort of a you problem. So let's move on. Let's talk about the game. Let's talk about system. Let's talk about structure. And let's start with the most otherworldly element of this. However you find it most convenient to play your TTRPGs, Mothership has thought of you. Like a messed up mannequin monster clattering towards you in an air vent, this game is surprisingly flexible. Do you like your games to fill just a single evening? Mothership can do that. You can make a character in 2 minutes. No player needs to know the rules beforehand, and lots of official adventures are so svelte they come in trifold pamphlets. Or would you like to do a longer story? But of course, the game says. Here's an adventure that's designed for maybe 3 or 4 evenings. Well, the whole time I've been talking, have you been imagining like a full D&D style campaign that lasts years? But of course, Mothership says. As if this is what it was designed for all along. Here's a city sourcebook with overarching macro plots as you revisit it time and time again, with shops packed full of expensive upgrades for your character, and a gigantic mega dungeon that could take you months to explore. Wait, you say. I thought this was supposed to be a horror game where our characters have no chance of surviving. But of course, says Mothership, giving you a truly bestial bestiary of monsters come adventure hooks come gods that use outsider art and SCP-like file fragments to leave plenty to your imagination in a way that is, I am not exaggerating, is genuinely a bit frightening to read. And most of these monsters carry the implications that if your players meet them, they will not survive. Wait, someone else says. Oh, what is it, sir? Says Mothership. This is a sci-fi game, and to me that means my players having a ship and getting money and upgrading it. I can't be doing that if players are dying all the time. But of course, says Mothership, and slips you this additional rulebook for managing a ship. In the GM's guide, there is even a list of suggested house rules that you can use to bend Mothership towards whatever you're looking for. Whether you'd like it to be a little meaner or simpler, perhaps you'd like your player characters to be a little cooler, or just more rewarded for surviving. And by and large, Mothership is weirdly successful at doing all of this, at turning its box sets into a toolbox from which you can just withdraw whatever experience you want. I do think it loses a little something in being all things to all people, but I'll talk about that later. But however you play Mothership, you are going to be playing with the same basic rules, so let's talk about them. Let's talk about the scaffolding that holds this house up. Don't try and hold your house up with scaffolding. That's not what scaffolding's for. Your house will fall down. Stop doing that! This review is so long. I know! What happened to respecting your audience's time? I respect that you can... I respect your ability... Good one. If you were going to watch all of this video, perhaps because you're interested in the consumer review equivalent of edging, did you know for $4, just $4, you can get access to almost double the Quinns Quest content? And released on the Patreon today is a brand new video all about how to teach role-playing games. In another life, I did a video on how to teach board games, so I thought, hey, why not make a video for everyone who wants to invite some friends over to experience the world of TTRPGs. But perhaps one or everyone involved in that process is intimidated. Also on the Patreon now is a full 75-minute interview with Mothership designer Sean McCoy, so give that a listen if you want to hear about the future of this game, or if you want to hear how Sean McCoy's love of horror began with him being ambushed in a concrete pipe when he was young. That's all. God, get on with it. Yeah, I was trying to. Knob. All right, let me teach you. Let me teach you something. When you are playing a horror TTRPG, if you want that game to sing, players need to want 2 contradictory things at once. 1, players, you gotta want bad things to happen to your character. You gotta go off exploring by yourself. You gotta throw open the door with the sinister scratching behind it. You have to declare, phew, I'm glad that's over, when it is clear the horror movie is not over and you have to look forward to your death, because that is your character's best scene and it will be the highlight of everyone else's evening. 2, players, you gotta not want bad things to happen to your character. When you inevitably find yourself being chased by some fibrous predator, you have to fight to stay alive with every ounce of that weak, panicky, blood-filled Capri Sun that you call a body. Yes, death is inevitable in this game. Doesn't mean it has to be you. Now, this is a contradiction that some players will totally get. Oh, I'm an actor in a horror movie. I'm toast. Say no more. And other players might struggle with, right? On some level, all TTRPGs are gambling, but horror games are the most gambling, and you gotta enjoy that gamble. You're gonna bet your character's body, their mind, their finances over and over again, and you gotta thrill when you win, and be totally chill when you lose. Mostly chill. You want to have some freak out, but it's kind of performative. So what's then cool about Mothership's rules is that they help players to achieve this fallacy, this splitting of the brain. You just roll some stats, you choose a class, you roll your loadout, and then you roll what nonsensical trinket you are carrying and what the patch on your jumpsuit says. All of which comes together like a Mad Lib that asks you, who is this freak? Like, if your patch says Queen of Hearts and you're carrying playing cards, okay, you're some kind of gambler. But if your patch says Queen of Hearts and you're carrying fuzzy handcuffs, okay, if you're an android, you're probably some kind of sex robot. But if you're a scientist, are you a sex scientist? Finally, players choose skills and you're good to go. It feels like inserting a coin into an arcade cabinet and then just a character sheet being printed out. There's even a high score in the corner, which is simply the number of evenings you have survived. So on the one hand, you probably don't want this person to die. You've thought about them at least a little bit. On the other hand, character creation is so fun and dumb, you're quite excited to do it again. And then helping you to enjoy every second you get to spend with this character while reminding them that they are profoundly impermanent is the coil at the heart of Mothership that keeps its clockwork ticking along. The panic system. So historically, horror TTRPGs would track your character's sanity. You could look at spooky things until you went crazy, which mechanically was the same as your character dying. And over time, the community began to see this depiction of mental health as more exploitative than it was strictly educational. In Mothership, the only system that players are forced to reckon with is something we all understand that's way funnier. Stress. If players look at something spooky and then fail a fear roll or a sanity roll, their stress ticks up. But get this, that's true of any dice roll in the game. Shoot at something and miss, your stress ticks up. Your scientist can't understand the alien fungus under their microscope, their stress ticks up. And then when something truly terrible happens, the GM can make you roll something called a panic check. Although this can also happen, quote, whenever you, the player, want. And then you have to try and roll over your total stress on a d20. And if you fail, the number you roll is the result you get on the panic table. Often a result that's both fun to roleplay and can have very tense consequences for your survival. And what this is doing is providing you with a kind of handrail that keeps you on the path of a horror movie. Characters have a constant, ungenerous, numerical reminder that if they stay in this environment for much longer, they're gonna lose it! With each point of stress unlocking a new, worse consequence. From the kind of workaday wig-outs you see at the start of a movie, to the full-on, foam-flecked freak-outs you see at the end. Also, I just find it truly hilarious that somewhere out there has to be a Mothership player who began their final showdown with the Xenomorph and then had to do that fight while simultaneously having a heart attack. But also, I love this so much. The total stress you accumulate during an adventure also acts as your experience points. When or if your character manages to later get some rest and relaxation, always at great expense, your total stress then drifts upwards into your saving throws, making you not smarter, certainly not faster, but just a touch more leathery. And the genius of this is that this risk-reward encourages players to be a little bit more reckless than they would otherwise, to go into plans or rooms that they might otherwise think better of, to go over to the alien's corpse and just check it's still dead while the viewer shouts at the screen. Finally, for a game where death can happen at any point and you are expected to be cool with that, it helps that Mothership has the coolest death mechanic I've ever encountered. So players in Mothership have a set, small number of wounds they can take before they just die. But every time you take a wound, you have to roll on a critical hit table, and some of those results are, you just f***ing die. And that's vitally important in a horror game because players should never feel safe at any point, especially not just because they're on max wounds. Also important, in this world, there are healing injections called stim packs. But if you take too many of them, you might just f***ing die. I'm being kind of facetious here. When you die, you do a death save, which has just a 50% chance of you being dead. Oh, Quinns, does that mean there's a 50% chance we stand back up? No. Absolutely not, but I'd recommend taking what largesse this game gives you. But here's the thing. When you do a death save in Mothership, you do it under a cup so no one can see what I've just realized this cup is translucent. You do it! I've got wet socks. Under a cup so no one can see what the result is, and you have to sit there like Schrodinger's cat with your very mortality hanging in the balance until another player goes over to your body to check your pulse. They are then allowed to peek under the cup and go, he's got a pulse, he might live. And what this does is it takes the best die roll of any evening and stretches it out like an Alfred Hitchcock dolly zoom so it can fill minute after minute after minute. If any game can teach players how exciting it is to stick your head into the jaws of death again and again, it is surely Mothership. As to how the rest of the roles in the game work, it's super simple. Mothership doesn't want you to get bogged down in any maths or twists. You just roll a D100 trying to get under your stat, and if you've got a skill, you add like 10 points to it. What is interesting though, is that in Mothership, there are no skills for two of the things that you might be relying on most for your survival. And one of which is stealth. Are you trying to hide from the man-sized spider thing that's chasing you? You're panically examining your character sheet looking for that stealth skill? It's not here. And the transcendent reason for that the designer of Mothership has talked about is that if there's a skill, a player can simply roll for it and say, I win. I do the skill check, I melt into the shadows. But a role-playing game is never anything more or less than a conversation, right? So what you've just done with that skill roll is that you have deleted the most exciting part of the conversation. Now let's think about what happens if you don't have a skill. It then entirely becomes about what you can pitch to the GM. You go, oh, there's a bed here, right? Okay, I'll crawl under the bed and I'm going to cover the reflective parts of my uniform and I hold my breath and I curl into a ball. And the GM can then rule on what kind of dice roll that is for you or the monster. But you see how much more exciting that is? The scene is now vivid. It's tainted with desperation. I feel like that's a rule we can all get behind, right? The more hardcore version of this is that Mothership has no rule for talking. There is no persuasion skill, there is no charisma stat. Because since this game is a conversation, surely the one thing we don't need a skill check for is conversations. Now some players that are naturally as quick on their feet aren't going to love this rule, but I, as a GM, someone who played Mothership, found myself adoring it because it forced my players to treat all NPCs as real people with real needs and real vulnerabilities. It forces players to think of who has the leverage in this situation. Do they trust this NPC to be kind to them when they need them? How does this NPC deal with being scared? Everyone just becomes more human. And in a setting that is rife with inhumanity and betrayal and greed, suddenly it means you can sprinkle the game with moments of real human connection, not because someone just passed a skill roll, but this player really cares about this NPC and it offers some much needed levity to the world. Also, this being a horror game, it means that your players treat NPCs as real people and then have to watch terrible things happen to those real people. But listen, while Mothership's rules do have all of these inarguably fun corners, and this is a game so simple and cunning that I genuinely enjoy teaching it and running it, these rules are good. But what's great about Mothership, what really makes me love it, is quite simply these books. We talked about presentation. Let's talk about the content that these books are presenting. You see, I think the TTRPG community has gotten a little caught up in what's obviously novel about Mothership. You know, its punk principles, the way it calls its books zines. But listen, Mothership is not a great RPG because it's punk and different. Mothership is punk and different while nailing absolutely everything an RPG has to do. I'm saying if the Mothership team ran a tattoo studio, they would be filing their taxes on the first day of the financial year. Let's start with Mothership's GM guide, the Warden's Operation Manual. I don't say this lightly. It's a marvel. There is no gated content you're paying for here. All of Mothership's rules are in the player's guide. This book is just much needed advice on everything, from how to build a good puzzle, to how to interpret dice rolls, to how to take notes. It is the best document I have ever read on how to GM. And how to GM not only this game, but other games. I had to ask Sean McCoy how this came about.
Everyone gets their GM training from Dungeons and Dragons. So like there's this oral history of like, how do you run games? We didn't want to be reliant on Hasbro or Wizards of the Coast to train our referees because we found that when you come from D&D, you have all this baggage about what D&D is, and you bring that to every game you play. But the questions we get are stuff like, isn't combat not fair? Or like, how come this weapon only does this damage, but this weapon does this damage? And we're saying like, right, yeah, you can't optimize for combat in this way. We don't really care if you all have the best weapons or all have the best armor. There's like a 10% chance you're going to die any time you take a wound anyway.
So we've got this great GM guide full of advice, and I've already mentioned this really good bestiary, unconfirmed contact reports. If you're the kind of GM who wants to flex their creative muscles and either make something genuinely frightening or just a wicked survival horror dungeon, my goodness, buy these books immediately. But me, this guy, I didn't use these books at all. Listen, just like I'm the kind of home cook who only cooks by using recipe books and getting inspired, I'm the kind of GM who loves nothing more than a truly shit-kicking module. Because that way, I get to delight in reading the thing, I get to do less prep, and then my players get an experience that's had 10 times as much love put into it. And listen, usually you want an RPG that you buy or get into to have maybe a couple of good adventures. Mothership has a fudging library. Please, take my hand. Allow me to take you on a tour of some of my favorites. These two official modules are, I think, the best things you can buy for Mothership, full stop. Gradient Descent is an exploration of an abandoned space station that used to manufacture androids, but is now under the control of an inconceivably intelligent AI. But this isn't just a dungeon, it's what's called a mega dungeon. What I'm talking about is a dungeon on the scale of an entire AAA video game. I'm not gonna spoil anything. This book's good as hell. And then we've got A Pound of Flesh. Oh, this book is so thought-provoking. This is basically a hub city to center your Mothership campaign around, and it's full of random tables to bring it to life as players potter around and get lost or try and eke out a piece of it to call their own. It's got maybe the best shops I've ever encountered in an RPG that your players will want to return to again and again. There's a whole hierarchy of brilliant NPCs who run the place. And you see this? I'm not gonna zoom in because of spoilers, but there are several different optional plots for you to pick from that mean whenever players come back to the station between their adventures, although you could just set a whole campaign here, the city has changed and this safe haven starts to feel less and less safe. I'm not gonna spoil anything. This book's good as hell. So that's those two modules, and now you're probably expecting me to continue this review by talking about the two other excellent official Mothership adventures, Dead Planet and Another Bug Hunt. And I could do that, even though I think these two are better, but I'm not going to. Because you know how I've said that the most important thing an RPG has to do is to get you, the GM, the players excited about the game, because only by getting you excited will you pour all of your time and energy into running the damn thing. Mothership's certainly done that, but it's also achieved something maybe even bigger, which is to get its own community excited to make and sell just extraordinarily high quality products for Mothership themselves. And one of the reasons I have been so excited to publish this very Mothership video is because I knew it would give me an opportunity to talk about some of my favorites. And dear reader, I have read dozens of these books. Couldn't be more excited to present to you what I think are the ones most worth your time. Warped Beyond Recognition is an adventure where the players are sent to investigate a ship that was performing experiments to see if they could make humans psychic, and they will reveal no more. Except to say this adventure is so polished you can see your face in it, it has its own soundtrack, unbelievably, and that's not the only surprise, it also comes with rules for if you want to have a psychic player character. Spoiler! You don't do that to your poor character. But also, you know, definitely do, it's awesome. Time After Time is a big module that invites players to try and salvage valuable technology from a laboratory on an asteroid that may have accidentally invented time travel. Once again, I can't spoil what happens next, but I think it might be the best time travel RPG module ever written. Definitely requires a lot of prep from the GM to run super well, but I don't know. I think there's a chance your players might end up remembering it for the rest of their lives. I've got to talk about Hull Breach. Hull Breach is astonishing. This is a 227-page anthology magazine of solid fan content, new rules, adventures, advice, and some fantastic items to scatter around your campaign for players to discover. But the production team have gone over and above to give the whole thing a beautiful layout, but also to knit this disparate content together, like a scattershot campaign setting. I honestly think it might be worth buying the whole of Hull Breach just for one 12-page adventure called Roadwork. It's one of my favorite adventures I've ever played, and I think the most my players have laughed in a year. It's such a brilliant concept. Can't recommend it enough. I also want to give a shout out to an unofficial Mothership module called Breach of Contract. I own this physically, which is like the RPG equivalent of having something on vinyl. Mothership has a lot of what you might call capitalist horror, where players are sort of owned by corporations, they're always in debt and hanging by a legal thread at all times. And then Breach of Contract, which I believe is written by an actual lawyer, is then just sort of a book of handouts. Empty contracts which you can give your players to sign. I had a ton of fun getting my players to sign the Android end-user license agreement to acknowledge receipt of their Android player, but there are also pre-filled versions of contracts for players to find in drawers and lockers that are adventure hooks. Super fun, totally on theme, the perfect thing to cement your players in this world. I started one of my Mothership campaigns by giving my players tons of paperwork to do. I can't think of a better way to begin a campaign of anything. Finally, I haven't read this yet, so this is a total punt, but there's a Mothership fan work called Archiver, but spelt weird, and this reframes Mothership so that players aren't sort of stereotypical survivors, but are in fact a documentary crew. And you then play Archiver with any pre-existing Mothership content, which then presumably becomes so much more hilarious and disturbing because you want to get literal close-ups and clean audio recordings of the horror. And just what a gloriously postmodern twist to give a game that's already about kind of living out horror movies, because here you are filming those movies and maybe even shaping the story you're going to tell in this environment by talking to some survivors and not others, maybe moving evidence, not filming something. Could not be more impressed by this idea. It gets more clever the more I think about it. So there's a summary of everything that makes Mothership worthy of your attention. Beautiful presentation, perfect adventures, built atop a rock-solid foundation of innovative rules. Is it a perfect game? I mean, mostly. Look, this is already a long review, but Mothership feels like such a seismic product in the TTRPG community that I think it's earned me being the most thoughtful critic I can. So here goes. So first off, where in almost every respect Mothership feels blindingly modern, there is one area where I think it feels actually regressive. It was one of my players who pointed this out. Mothership understands that one of the tasks it has to succeed at, and it does succeed at this, is to capture the kind of practical jeopardy that you are in, right? It has the critical hit tables, it has stress, it has your financial worries, but it has nothing, nada, to help create or catalyze the emotional stakes, to make you feel like your character sheet is more than an island. For example, to make you feel like you're one half of a relationship or part of a whole team that stands for something bigger than the fact that you all just spawned into the same level together. Listen, even the schlockiest, most House of Wax-esque horror movie has 20 minutes at the start where we get to know the characters and establish power dynamics, how they know each other. This character fancies this character is teased by the others. What's the hierarchy here? Who is most responsible for us being in this mess? Who's the doubter who doesn't believe this is dangerous? Who's the outsider who wasn't even supposed to be here? And the reason for that is that the brightness of this humanity then makes the darks of the horror seem that much darker. And it makes death bigger because it's not just startling anymore, it's interesting. This character for sure deserves to die, which means we all want it. But then it's delicious when he doesn't. This character, they doubt themselves, which means when their plan actually works, it's that much more delightful. And then when this character is the last one of you left alive, the final girl, you've all got your head in your hands going, I cannot believe this story comes down to her. The Mothership Warden's Manual has this excellent diagram for how to make interesting and resonant NPCs. It's wild to me that the game doesn't think to do that, maybe, with the protagonists of the story. If I'm being coy, I would say that Mothership is like a xenomorph, a creature with one giant spine and no heart. It's so funny to me that Mothership has page after page after page of rules for like, oh, you need money, therefore you will do this thing. And it even has a rule for sex. But there's nothing in there about maybe your characters are in a relationship. It is cool that Mothership has this character creation that takes 2 minutes. I don't know if I love that it's the only kind of character creation it has. I actually ran 2 campaigns of Mothership, and at the end of the first one, which is about 4 sessions long, I asked my players what they thought, and they said, yeah, this was fun, but By the end of it, I still didn't really know who my character was. That was like the biggest piece of feedback my players had. So when I ran a second campaign of Mothership, I made sure to do that work myself. I wrote a whole short prologue about how my players knew each other. I constantly asked them questions about their characters as a GM. I forced them to ask questions of each other in character, and then finally, like 3 or 4 evenings into playing with these characters, we got to this point where my players were looking at each other and going, wow, if any of us die now, that's gonna be epic. And then the prospect of dropping these characters into a horror movie became so exciting. It became huge. It was a big boost to this game, but didn't come from the game, came from me. My other criticism of Mothership? This game, with all of its brightly colored books and tables that are just overflowing with content, it feels like, if you look at it all at once, someone upended a backpack full of loose Lego onto your table. It's bright, it's colorful, you can socket it all together, you're excited to do so. It was only when I started playing a big campaign of Mothership and started trying to like socket these modules together that, to continue this analogy, I found out that this Lego, some of it is maybe manufactured in different factories and doesn't socket together without a hammer or a blowtorch. Mothership is actually quite resistant to the idea of a canon or a story Bible. In fact, there is hardly any world building in the core rulebooks at all. What these books have in common is like ideas, mechanics, items, vibes. Something I read somewhere, some official copywriting, is that in Mothership, the only canon is what's happening at your table. And listen, maybe I'm uncool, maybe I'm a bit anal, and this certainly won't be a problem if you're making all your own content for Mothership, but for someone like me who wanted to play with all these modules in a big story, we're not talking about the same world. Case in point, Mothership's ship book, The Shipbreaker's Toolkit, contains the official rules for spaceships, and these things are rickety as balls. Now, let's jump over to the official adventure Dead Planet, written by a different person. This tells the story of the player's ship crash landing on a moon. But then, the player's ship is able to take off again with the assumption that spaceships in this universe are like something out of Firefly or the movie Alien, where ships can land on a planet and fly away again. Are you kidding me? These things couldn't survive an impact with a cricket ball. Or like, 1 in every 4 Mothership players around that is going to be role-playing an android player character, right? Mothership is so laissez-faire, it doesn't even tell you what an android is. So maybe a player imagines themselves as like a proper robot, like a C-3PO situation. Great, until you get shot and roll bleeding on the critical hit table. So then you go, okay, well, maybe I'm more like the milk-filled androids from the Alien movies? Okay, but then what happens if that milky android is launched out of an airlock into the vacuum of space? Do they asphyxiate in your canon? Do they get crushed by the pressure in your canon? These are tremendously intense calls for a GM to have to work out with their players. Or like, dumb question, but is there internet in the future? Because hacking into a ship or a moon base's network to solve a dungeon from the safety of the foyer is not mentioned in any of these modules. So you're gonna think, okay, there's no internet, that's not a thing. But then the official city guide includes a faction of hackers, and now I'm confused. Or like, how big is a computer? It's an insane question, but lots of Mothership modules riff on this cassette punk idea where computers are massive and display in like 2-tone monitors. But that then means that copying information in those computers or stealing them is a whole rigmarole, whereas other modules assume that cyberware is so advanced you could have a computer in your finger and that's completely normal.
This is always like a huge sci-fi problem, right? And it's weird that fantasy works better than sci-fi in this way, because in fantasy you're like, how does this dungeon work, right? And you're like, oh, it's magic. You could probably shove a rake into this panel and it'll probably work. So usually my stock answer with technology is like, 1, you have to just be a little open. Like you're trying to engage your players in the world. And if they're saying, I'm an engineer, is there a panel or something nearby? Like your job is just to largely think like, yes. In a sci-fi campaign, eventually water has to find its own level.
And to be clear, that is exactly what happened in my campaign. Over time, the water sort of found its own level. I just think it's particularly unfortunate that Mothership is both a sci-fi game and a horror game that wants to build tension by being really hard and numerical. Because I found that when we had to establish a shared vision, it was when someone's physical or financial well-being hung in the balance. And that can take all of the atmosphere that Mothership works so hard to create and vent it from the room a little bit. As a player is like, wait, can I not control the doors on our spaceship from my like datapad thing? And you as the GM are left thinking, yep, That does sound reasonable. Let me quickly think about whether that puts my entire adventure in the toilet. Just a tip for GMs. If your players do encounter an exploit in your system that will let them solve the entire adventure without lowering the beer in their player character's left hand, let them do it. They're gonna love every second of it. Let me just take a second here to point out that maybe I'm being unreasonable. One of the most beautiful things about Mothership is that this game gives ample room to different authors to express their take on the world. And then I'm just sat here griping that I have to do some amount of minimal effort to patch them together if I want to play with several in the same universe. I don't know. I truly don't know. I would like you to play Mothership and see if it bothers you. I am genuinely curious if this is me being hella anal in wanting an established fixed canon in this game, or if maybe I'm onto something and it is quite important to the magic circle that exists around the TTRPG table that we're all imagining exactly the same movie in our head with the same possibility space. I should also take the time to add here that if Mothership didn't have this slightly jumbled up vibe between all of its official and unofficial modules, I might be denied what is maybe my very favorite single thing about this game, which is that each of these modules has like different equipment and loot and information for players to find, right? Like your players might leave another bug hunt with a rocket launcher and a sniper rifle. They might leave the time travel adventure with a truly cursed time-bending periscope. They might leave the pound of flesh space station with a line of truly frightening and disgusting cyberware, as well as a synthetic anaconda. And while any Mothership module by itself is a horror movie, there is something so delightful about the players from one horror movie entering the next horror movie with gear that makes it a sort of new game plus that lets them disobey the script of this movie, because now they have 2 robot apes and a backpack full of Semtex and a month's supply of anti-anxiety medication and a vibro machete. And this particular vibe of the horror movie has changed into something more like a Evil Dead undermining of the genre. And yet, it doesn't make these modules easier or safer. It just makes them more bombastic and lets players feel cooler and think bigger before they get absolutely smoked by the game engine. So, we did it, everybody. That is my long-ass review. If you've been tempted by the game you've seen in this video and are thinking about sticking your toe into these oily, seething waters, let me give you a bit of advice on what to buy. The core set they sell, this is still great. It gets you all of the kind of core rulebooks, a couple of starting adventures, and the cutest baby's first little messed up GM screen. Can I open it up? Look at that. But if you can afford it, I personally think that the deluxe set, which comes with Grand Uncle GM screen, is a better purchase, not because of the bigger GM screen, but because the 2 additional modules it comes with, Pound of Flesh and Gradient Descent, are my 2 favorite Mothership books. However, if you want the cheapest way to get into Mothership, let me do a little public service announcement here, because you can actually play Mothership for free. If you go onto the Tuesday Night Games website and select a PDF of the game's core rulebook, the Player's Survival Guide, that will cost you $0. And then you can just get stuck into making adventures yourself, see if you like the system. Although, if you are going to put all the time into making an adventure, I might just pay $10 for a module like Another Bunk Hunt, or even one of the Trifold adventures to see roughly how a professional might do it. Woo! That's long. What a long review. We've got one last review coming up in Quinns Quest Season 1, and it is, believe it or not, a game I like even more than Mothership. Finally, let's hear from Sean McCoy one more time so he can pay it forward by listing a couple more games that he recommends.
One that I am really interested in is Fist by a designer that goes by Claymore. You can get it on Itch. I think Exalted Funeral might have hard copies, but it's basically like a Metal Gear Solid paranormal military game with some slick, graphic design, but also just a genre that I feel like became popular after the advent of RPGs and hasn't really been delved into as much as I think would be awesome. Is like all these ridiculous Metal Gear Solid NPCs like Vulcan Raven or whatever, like you could just play those people. And then if you like Mothership, one of the games that was sort of coming up around the same time that we were starting is called Stay Frosty. By KCG of Garsky Games. He made a game that's a lot more like Aliens. They've got like modules like Slipgate, Choke Point, where like demons are running through, and it's a blast. So like if you're into this Mothership sort of sci-fi space, and you want to see what people are doing, stay frosty. And if you're not, like Fist, I think is really cool.
As this Quinns quest draws to a close, we, as always, place this game into the archives for safekeeping. Perhaps to be dug up by the next generation of mankind. Or perhaps to be unearthed by aliens who stumble across it, dig it up, long after you and I have fled the nest. Or died trying. Perhaps they'll take the joy of TTRPGs back to their home world. Or perhaps they'll burn it, like so much toxic trash. But not if I'm still around. You better believe I'll be fighting those aliens on behalf of the TTRPG community. I'm serious! Don't come for our games, you aliens! Good night.